transportation system and promote clean mobility options. And here we're going to have a diverse set of perspectives on how to do that, how to, as the organizers say, tread lightly into the urban future. So Morten Kabell, I wanted to start with you. You are the Mayor of Technical and Environmental Affairs for the city of Copenhagen, a city which, in my experience, has really been held up as the gold standard around the world for intentional design decision-making to promote cycling. And I understand you've recently adopted a carbon neutrality goal by 2025.
That's true.
And so I wanted to understand, just to give perspective, here in Southern California, we're wrestling with whether we should cut transportation emissions by 19% or 21%. And you've decided to completely wipe out carbon pollution by going carbon neutral in the next 7 years. So I wanted to understand how you think that's possible and how that shift happened from limit carbon pollution to eliminate it.
Well, you can say a lot of cities around the world has a goal of going 80% reduction in 2050 or whatever goal they have. We thought of, why not go all the way? Show that it is possible. Of course, it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge, but we are taking that on. And you can say in Copenhagen, a lot of the carbon emissions are heating and cooling, of course, of buildings. We are a cold country, so a lot of heating. During wintertime, a lot of electricity production as well. And simply shifting that over to sustainable fuels. And then transport. Yeah. And that basically that means, well, getting rid of the fossil car and making people move to bicycling, to public transport. And if you want to use a car, well, then use a modern car, electrical or hydrogen car instead, for those people who need car transport. But for all the lazy ones, bicycling and public transport is the way to go, and bye-bye car.
Oh, great. Okay. Great, I think there's some resonance here for that.
Well, it takes a lot of investments, of course, but basically building a bicycle infrastructure is way cheaper than any other kind of infrastructure you're going to build. One good example, the last 13 years of investments in Copenhagen, we have spent $320 million on bicycling. That includes bicycle bridges, bypasses for bikes and so on. Incidentally, those $320 million is the same amount that is going to be spent on one single 2.5-mile bypass for cars north of Copenhagen. Yeah. So you can choose 2.5 mile of bypass for cars or 13 years of bike investments. For a poor city around the world, I know what I would choose.
Perfect. Deputy Mayor Christophe Najdovski from Paris, you've received a lot of attention in your city for efforts to close streets off at certain times to vehicles and give those streets back to cyclists and pedestrians. And I think these are incredibly popular. And I also wanted to hear how you transition from a one-day street closure or one-week street closure to permanent infrastructure for cycling and walking. Here in Los Angeles, we have Ciclavia, and it's very, very popular. But as we've tried to make some more permanent bicycling improvements, recently there's been such an uproar, such an opposition from angry drivers, angry motorists, that some of those improvements have had to be taken out, which is quite depressing, really. So can you talk about how you take from temporary to permanent, and have you had to struggle with the same challenges of angry motorists who feel that should be their space?
Yes, it's always difficult to speak after Copenhagen because we are so far away from what they have done. But I think that, Morten, you have faced also the same problems maybe 20 or 30 years ago. We have, when you shift towards a sustainable and a new mobility, there are always resistance and oppositions. But now we have the support of the majority of the Parisians. Year after year, the people who own a car, the number of the people who own a car is reducing in Paris. We have just 38% of the people who now own a car, and just 10% of the Parisians who use their cars to commute every day. So 90% of them are using other ways of moving, public transport, of course, but also walking and biking. And we are trying also to develop the active transportation, of course, with a plan of 150 million euros by 2020 to develop bike lanes, especially like London did with the super cycle highways. We have the ambition to have a real network, to have a continued and safe network, to make also the possibility and the opportunity for people who are not safe today to take their bike. But we have also to continue our investment in the public transport. Mm-hmm. So we have to develop also the rail, the buses, and also the metros, because there are still needs, and especially for the suburbs. But the question is not just in the center of the city, but also the relation with the suburbs. But there is also a social demand by the people. They are asking us to have more spaces for pedestrians, mm-hmm. More spaces for places to live and to be, not just places to go to a point A to a point B. And of course, the question, for example, of the pedestrianization of the right bank of the River Seine in a distance of 3.3 kilometers in the center of Paris was very controversial last year, but now we made a survey in June this year, and we have the support of 63% of the Parisians. So we are continuing in this way.
And what do you think accounts for that, getting across that bridge from initial opposition to acceptance?
It's difficult to say what is the tipping point, but I think that there is also a question of public health with the air pollution. So when you have a repetition of peaks of pollution, there is also a social demand with by the people to have a cleaner air. And we know that the traffic and the road traffic is the first cause of the air that the people are breathing. So right. The relation is simple, so that we have this, and this is why we have the support of the people.
Yeah. Yeah. Ben Plowden, Director of Surface Strategy and Planning with Transport for London. Continuing on the theme of controversy and politically challenging policy decisions, London, of course, has tackled congestion charging. And I love looking back at some of the headlines surrounding the congestion charging. You have, I want to punch Ken's lights out, referring to then Mayor Livingston, or congestion is wonderful, someone convinced, or in the mayor's own words, anticipating the day of implementation, it will clearly be a bloody day. So this was not without challenge. And so what I wanted to understand from you is why do it?
Right.
Why did you take this on when you have so many other things to manage, whether it's Vision Zero goals, safe pedestrian cycling, whether it's running the buses on time? Why tackle something as politically challenging as congestion pricing?
So there was a very clear problem around congestion in the central area of the city. It was caused by a relatively small number of people commuting into the city centre during the peak time of day, and it was adding huge cost to business operating in and out of that area and within that area. So interestingly, there was a strong consensus in London that something had to be done to deal with that problem. And there were various studies done of the cost to business of that congestion. So I'm double timing my drivers. I've got more trucks and I need to deliver a certain amount of goods because I have to get there on time. So Ken put congestion charging in his manifesto when he was standing for mayor in 2000. He won a very clear mandate from the electorate to introduce it. He set a date in 2013 that it would go live, and then he said to Transport for London, right, now you have to go and deliver this thing. It was quite a specific area, quite a small area in the centre of London where the congestion problem was very acute. And crucially, I think it had strong support from the business community, who were bearing the large part of the cost from a small number of private motorists coming in. So there was a strong case for it, and it both enabled a whole set of other things to happen, like improvements of the bus network, improvements of the public realm, cycling schemes, improvements in road safety, but those things also helped support the introduction of congestion charging. So for example, if you were a motorist who was commuting in and you were not willing to pay the charge from the day that it was introduced, we hugely improved the quality of the bus network serving central London. We had, of course, an existing underground network, so that was there. So you ran these things in parallel so that by the time you got to the launch date, people had some meaningful choices as to how to get into central London. And we weren't talking about a huge number of people. Most people, as in Paris, were already coming into central London by public transport anyway. It was a small number of people still driving that was causing quite a significant problem. So it was really part of a package of things that had a clear justification. There were clear economic benefits to the city, and the number of people involved was relatively small, but those people decided not to drive in, and to either not drive, come in at all, or come in some other way, had a huge effect on congestion in the city centre. And crucially, it worked from the first day. So had it gone wrong, which was Ken's concern about it being a bloody day, it would have seriously questioned its credibility. But because it worked, it relied on existing technology, not new technology. That was a very important part of why it was seen as a credible thing to do.
Wonderful. I'm going to go to Mark Frohnmayer, the president and founder of Arcimoto. Many of the previous panelists have spoken about efforts to limit reliance on personal vehicles, whether that's through street closures or through disincentive policies, or through incentives to do other things in the form of street design for cycling. I think you have a different vision. You have a different approach at how to lure people away potentially from driving. Maybe you could speak about your innovation.
Well, and I was approaching it from a personal level, not a public policy level. So in Oregon, we actually just passed the ability for the state to do congestion pricing, for example, up in Portland, where you just can't build more roads. But rewind 10 years when I started Arcimoto, it was a question of just standing on a busy street corner, watching the cars go by and saying, there's one person in the driver's seat of almost every single one of those cars. They're 4,000 pounds. They take up a ton of space. It's madness. I would like to get across town in a sedentary way on a rainy night some of the time, and I don't have an option for that type of a choice. And that was really what motivated the creation of Arcimoto. And rather than tell you about what we're building, we're going to run just a short video that shows you what we've built over those 10 years.
So much fun. I mean, this is incredible.
And that's how people react every single time. We just wanted to create an insanely efficient, everyday electric vehicle so we could go on late night runs for hemp milk and chicken-free eggs without burning down the planet. But it turns out achieving a black belt in efficiency made the Arcimoto SRK a ninja in the fun department. The independent dual-motor front-wheel drive offers instant torque, sport handling, and cat-like balance. But is it useful? You bet your heated seats it is. For the first time, extraordinary fun and daily utility have been combined in a single ultra-efficient vehicle. We've created a whole new category, the fun utility vehicle. So in response to the bloated and overcompensating SUV, we say, fun utility. The SRK is 10 times more efficient. Hey, big city parking. Fun utility means you can park 3 SRKs in one spot. I don't know about you, but if I had $100,000, I wouldn't burn it all on one luxury electric car. I'd buy a $12,000 Arcimoto and $88,000 worth of memories. Reserve yours now, and let fun utility be your rallying cry as we usher in a new era of clean and awesome transportation.
So, the real question that motivated the company was, how do we catalyze a shift to a sustainable transportation system? What is the vehicle that can exist on the road today that can also exist on the road of the future? And that's been, it took us really 8 iterations of development to get to the product, something that weighs just a little more than 1,000 pounds, fits 3 to a parking space. It's basically the size of a large touring motorcycle, but that solves that daily driving problem in the absence of a good public transportation system, in the absence of fantastic bicycling options that you would find in European cities, for example.
Great. And just by way of follow-up, we've all seen a lot of these vehicles out here in the expo. I wonder what it is that you need. What is designed, if cities have a desire, for example, to have people drive your vehicle as opposed to a larger, more polluting vehicle, is your premise that this product is going to be so good that it sells itself, or that cities need to make intentional design decisions to incent your product over a traditional vehicle? Well,
I think this gets to the question sort of how do you get there? From a public policy standpoint, the public policy can be shaped from even just a basic pricing level to incentivize what you want from a public policy level and disincentivize what you don't want. So you do congestion pricing in order to disincentivize people driving single occupant vehicles into the downtown core, and then you use the proceeds of that to fund light rail and public transit and hyperloops and all the rest. And I think there's definitely a place for that public incentive because we're not there yet. You go out on the street here, you don't see fun utility vehicles driving all around. You see single occupant, 4,000-pound gas burning cars. And I think there's definitely a place in the public policy level to incentivize that, even in terms of individual vehicle purchase.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, a theme that a lot of you are talking about is really behavior change. We're all interested in promoting cleaner transportation choices and having people use them. And so I wanted to ask you all to reflect on, in your experience, kind of what's the psychology behind this? What works to promote behavior change? And also, I think, equally as important, what hasn't worked? What should Los Angeles cross off the list and not waste any time on doing? Because there's a theory that it might have worked, but it did not.
Well, I think the point is to make the right choice the easy choice. I mean, the reason why Copenhageners ride the bicycle to work, that we have a modal share of 62% bicycling in commuting, is not because Copenhageners are greener than anybody else. I mean, we are as lazy as anybody else in the world. But the only reason why we ride a bike is because it's the fastest way to get to work. So we've made. I mean, it's about removing car lanes, putting in bike lanes instead, and that is of course a pretty good incentive. Copenhagen is a cold city, a lot of snow and sleet in wintertime. Well, City Council adopted a policy where we clear the bicycle lanes in the mornings before we clear the roads for snow. That's a pretty good signal to people that who's being prioritized and who's not. So obviously you have to do a lot of these things to make sure that the right choice is the easy choice. And I think that's what it's all about in each and every one of our steps. Basically, we know in transport policy that if you build it, they'll come. And that goes for highways, and it goes for bicycle lanes. So it's a matter of choice. What do you want? And if you want green solutions, if you want solutions that are space efficient, then you need to build for those space efficient solutions. And those are basically bicycling and public transport. But if you want to build highways to have 16 lanes of congestion, go ahead and waste your day.
Yeah.
And yes, I've been driving in LA. Whoa.
Yeah. Well, similarly, I was in Copenhagen last month and was taken on a bike tour of the city, and kept trying to ride, at the same level as my colleague, and nobody would tolerate a conversation pace because everyone was trying to get somewhere. I constantly was told to step aside because people wanted to get, because it is truly the fastest way to get around, and people are moving.
And that's true. We have congestion on the bike lanes. I mean, I live in a street where we do. I live in a street where if I look out my window in the morning, at 8 o'clock I see 8, 10, 12 cars waiting for red light, but I see 200 bicycle riders. And the last ones of those won't make it at the first green light. So there, of course, we have capacity problems. We have 48,000 bicycle riders commuting on that street every day. So there we need to make some tough choices in the coming years. That may be removing another car lane, dividing the space to the bike lanes, and of course. But the problem is, of course, when you get down to only having one car lane in each direction, well, that is a tough choice. But on the other hand, when 9% of Copenhageners are driving a car every day and 91 are using green and active modes of transport, we have to make those choices as a city council. I mean, otherwise it would be irresponsible of us.
I actually want to pick up on that theme of tough decisions, because I think actually a lot of what we're talking about here requires leadership. And I think whether we're talking about converting driving lanes to bicycle lanes, whether we're talking about congestion charging, it comes down to having that vision and having that leadership to sometimes overcome, I think in the case of London, overcome strong opposition, a majority opposition to what you're proposing. So I've been working with a council member in Seattle, and he's talking about how do we get across this bridge from kind of no way, no how to public acceptance. In other words, it's just how we do things in Seattle. And he talked about the example of parking pricing. There was initially a lot of pushback on parking pricing, and now it's just how we do things. It's just accepted. And so I wanted to ask you all to reflect on just that question of leadership, of what it takes and how you can kind of get across and come over from that initial strong opposition to acceptance, and not just acceptance, but to really strong public support for the policies that you're advocating?
I would like to react about the initiative of Mark and to say that the question is about what we are calling in France autosolism. I don't know if that word exists here, but we can maybe translate it in autosolitude. That means being alone in his own car and using only his own car to go to work or to commute or to move. So the question is now, how do we go from this autosolism to or autosolitude to a combined mobility, to a multimodal mobility? That means also, of course, using public transport, developing active transportation, and also using shared mobility. And this is an example of shared mobility. We can have this kind of new vehicles that are taking a small place in the public space, and also with maybe in a disposition where it's in a shared mobility. So the question is, I think that when we talk about LA, we are always thinking about the city of cars. But when we are looking at the past, I saw last year a documentary made by a Swedish filmmaker called Fredrik Gertten. The documentary is called Bikes versus Cars. And it's very interesting because I did not know that there were in Los Angeles dozens and tens of lines of tramways after the World War II, and that they have been removed by the car industry to let the place for the construction of the freeways. So it was a political choice, and so we have the possibility, the opportunity also to make political choices and other choices that have been taken by the past. So we can also have the will. Copenhagen and the cities of the north of Europe have taken the advantage 30 or 40 years ago. But if we have the political will, we can also shift towards sustainable mobility and a combined mobility, not just the auto-solitude.
Well, and I thought that the point actually that you made in terms of what happens when you have you're down to just one lane of traffic in each direction. And an exercise that I do sometimes is I'll go out at night in my residential neighborhood and I'll walk, and don't do this if you live on a very busy street at night, but just walk down the middle of a residential street and take a second to realize that that street is essentially made so that one person can pass one other person in a car. And then maybe there's room for cars to park on the sides. And you'll realize just how giant our roads are, just how giant that infrastructure is. And so if you think, even when you get down to just one lane, because you've got a big bike lane and so on, how big does that lane need to be? If you've got motorized transport that's capable of going fast, how wide does it need to be to carry one person? And can we start thinking of mobility, again, like as in the case of Arcimoto, we're building something that can be your daily driving vehicle. So it's something you can drive to work, you can go to the store, and so on. But the long-term vision is that it's really part of that last mile or last several mile solution. So you take the transit option to a station, and then there's a bank of them there that you share or that you can check in and check out, or that are driving themselves and pick you up and take you where you want to go. So I think that there needs to be that realization of just how much space we dedicate, how much the 40% of our urban tapestry that we dedicate to asphalt, pave it over more dead than the deadest desert, so that how can we be stuck in congested traffic given how much space we use for cars? And I think that's once we bridge that gap, that's really that thought gap that people will go, oh, this is insane.
So I think you're right to pick up leadership as an issue, Amanda. And in my experience, leadership at city level, LA, Copenhagen, Paris, London, is critical. That's why I think elected mayors are a crucial part of this process of transforming cities. from one kind of time in the city to another. And in my experience, what elected mayors do, they set out a vision. Mayor Garcetti did it very convincingly yesterday. He made very clear what direction he wants the city to go in transportation terms. And then two things change. One is that the bureaucracy that the city is operated by changes. The expectations of the senior management change. What progresses your career changes. So a generation ago, you would have made a career building big roads. Now, increasingly in TfL, for example, that's not how you make your career. You do other stuff. You repurpose roads for other purposes. And that then changes the choice environment of your citizens and your consumers. So suddenly, to your point, it becomes easier to choose the right thing to do, to take the bike, to take the integrated public transport journey. And that then becomes a virtuous circle whereby it's much more difficult for an elected politician then to say, oh, forget all this cycling, I'm going to start building expressways again. That's just not what happens in that city anymore, to your point about Seattle. So it starts with political leadership. Yeah. The leader says to the bureaucracy, I'd like you to do different things than your predecessors did. That creates environments where people choose different sorts of transportation choices, they choose different sorts of housing, and then you get that virtuous circle whereby that becomes reinforcing. The question really is, how long does it take to get that loop going? Yeah. And as long as what the first person to do it goes well, or well enough, then I think you start this pattern whereby you get this very different paradigm for how cities are supposed to operate.
Right. Maybe in addition of what Mark said, just one sentence. We have on our roads, we have saturated roads, but they are saturated with vehicles, but not with persons. Mm-hmm. So the question is, do we have to transport vehicles or do we have to transport persons? Yes. And I think that the answer is in the question.
Exactly. Just a real quick tag on to what Ben was saying as well is, when you think about leadership, leadership is about articulating that vision and then making sure that you're bringing everybody along. So you're saying, hey, this promised vision that we're going to build is actually going to be awesome, and but there's a big social equity component as well, because if you suddenly get rid of the ability for people to get to their jobs, then it's not a win for the electorate, and you'll have a huge amount of pushback. But if you say we're going to invest heavily in public transit options, we're going to make sure that you can get into the downtown core before you go ahead and implement the things that really kind of punishes the driver for making the wrong choice, then that's part of easing that or catalyzing that transition. Yeah.
So I want to take this conversation and bring it down to the level of Los Angeles, because I hear quite often, Los Angeles is not London, it's not Paris, we're different, we're unique, we're our own, it's not even Eugene, not San Francisco. So thinking about this massive, messy, sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles, but flipping that around, what excites you about the opportunity for mobility innovation in Los Angeles? It's not a traditional European-style, dense, single-centered, walkable city, but I feel it has quite a bit of opportunity for mobility innovation. And so just thinking, some of you, I don't know if it's your first time to Los Angeles here or you've been here many times, but what that you've observed makes you feel that there's promise and hope for LA to be a leader in the transportation transformation we're all talking about.
So shall I start? Sure. I think there's three things. One is the leadership you mentioned. I think that as a visitor to Los Angeles, seeing the commitment from the politicians, particularly Mayor Garcetti, is very important. I think secondly, the scale of the ambition, because this is not a city that you'd sort of start with if you were going to repurpose it for sustainable mobility, but a city saying, yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to make it a different kind of city using a whole variety of devices and tools. And the third thing I think is very interesting is the kind of openness of the city to everybody's ideas. This conference is an example, but the mayor said yesterday, if you've got an idea, bring it to us and we'll probably want to try it out. So that notion that somehow this is a place where experimentation is important and it won't all work, but we actually want to do a mix of conventional metro improvements, we want to do better buses, cycleways, but also stuff around tech and data, these things that potentially add value in a way they might have to in this kind of city, I think is really important. That openness to new ideas is going to be critical, I think.
Oh. And I just want to reflect personally, I live in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and I feel there's a very different attitude towards innovation and change in Los Angeles than there is in the Bay Area. You get a lot of communities that feel things are working perfectly and we just don't want anything, sort of the NIMBY attitude. Just don't change anything, it's perfect right now, although of course it's far from perfect. I sense in Los Angeles there's sort of a hunger for innovation because there's so much frustration with the existing 100 hours a year people are spent stuck in traffic, that there's really a sense of what can we try, and it's quite refreshing in my experience.
I think in terms of the question of what is exciting about it is that it's, I mean, some people are excited by hard problems, and this one is a really hard problem. But I think to your point, people feel, like people here, well, every time I come here, you get on the freeway, it's like, oh, this is just the worst experience. And so, and it's not like in the Bay Area, you can kind of stay in your little bubble in Palo Alto or in Menlo Park or in San Fran, but here everything is so spread out and you're going all over the place. So there's that obvious and pressing need to just about everybody here that the problem needs to be fixed. And I think also it's sort of that worst case scenario where it's so spread out and there's so much existing built infrastructure that it creates the opportunity to say your solution must fix the worst problem set out there, which is sort of well embodied here.
I think we are facing all the same problems, of course with specific situations, but for example, the resistance and also the oppositions for the implementation of new types of mobility, we are also having this type of opposition. I would say that there is a kind of a form of dictatorship of the status quo that we are all facing. But there are also, and I think it's also a global movement, there are also a social demand and also a new way of mobility, especially with the young people. For example, they don't buy maybe cars like parents did before, and they are using also the cars differently. They are more using bikes. Morten told me before that in Los Angeles also there are more and more bikes. For me, it's the first time I'm coming here in LA, and I must admit that my first impression was, of course, that there were a lot of cars, not just driving but also parking, and that's very impressive when you come for the first time. But I think there is also a global movement, but also resistances. So we have to find the key to make the change, but there is also a social demand for a more sustainable, more resilient cities, and also a way of moving with the young people who are changing also the cities, our cities.
Yeah, and your mayor, if I can just follow up, your mayor is the chair of C40, this global network representing 90 cities, and I think roughly 1/4 of GDP is reflected by these cities. Can you speak a bit about your role in kind of promoting some of these best practices and scaling up some of these solutions across that network?
Yes, Mayor Anne Hidalgo is the president of the C40 movement. It's a federation of 90 cities all over the world, and we are trying to share our experiences and also to go towards the energetic transition, because we are all facing the question of the global change and the climate change. We see that the climate change is caused by the humanity, but the humans, and that our behavior is in question, and that the question of the transportation is a sector that emits a lot of greenhouse gases. So there are some commitments, for example, to go to the end of the fossil fuel cars and also for the buses. By 2025, for example, for the buses, and by 2030 or more for the cars in these cities or part of the cities. So it's also an emulation and like a competition, but a great competition between cities to go further.
Well, to continue on that, I think that especially what you see in corporations like C40 is that we're really facing that nations are talking, but cities are acting. And I think we are really learning a lot from these fora, that the good solutions that are being implemented in one city is very easily transferred to other cities and really being learned from the rest of us. I mean, when London did congestion charging, immediately it popped up on the political agenda in Copenhagen, for instance, and saying, well, if London can do this, why can't we in Copenhagen? When Paris is deciding to ban diesel cars in a few years' time, well, obviously that's something that we reflect on and saying, we should probably do the same thing. When Shanghai is replacing all their buses by electrical buses, and almost already have done so, then of course it makes it certain that when we got the discussion in Copenhagen and everybody says it can't be done, it's like, interesting. Shanghai with 24 million people is doing it, so why can't we do that? And that, I think, cooperation is so strong today between cities that we are bypassing a lot of the problems and challenges that we otherwise would have. And thereby I think that you can see that a lot of the good solutions that cities are having is being copied, stolen by mayors all around the world. And that's a good thing. And therefore I also see a lot of good things happening in LA, and I think you can say the big thing here is I suppose, is that if you can change LA, then you can change any city. The sheer scale of the transformation here is such that it will inspire any city around the world to do a lot of the same things. And a lot of things are happening. I mean, we're talking bike lanes now in LA. We are talking about Long Beach being transformed into becoming, well, a very bike-friendly city, for instance. So you also see that cooperation and competition among cities here in the greater Los Angeles area that I think is really pushing the whole area forward. Yeah.
So I'm being asked to participate in a commission, a national commission that's looking at decarbonizing transportation, and it's a 50 by 50 goal, so 50% reduction by 2050. And one of the introductory slides in this effort talked about, are we pursuing the right kind of change? Because there could be many pathways to get to a pure decarbonization target. And certain will just go down that path, and other choices will have all sorts of sort of attendant co-benefits with them around economy and health. And I wanted to ask you to reflect in particular on social equity, because it was raised earlier. And as you think about these efforts to promote cleaner transportation, cleaner mobility, how do you think about maximizing social equity so that along that pathway towards decarbonization, we're also lifting up traditionally disadvantaged communities and sort of remedying these sort of long disparities in access to opportunity and income?
Well, I think a good example is, for instance, Shanghai and the transformation into electrical vehicles, mopeds, scooters, buses, and so on that they are having. I mean, suddenly Shanghai is becoming a much more quiet city. That's good for health because we know that noise pollution kills. And we know that the diesel, of course, emits a whole lot of particles that kills. And there is a huge social equity part of that, because we also know that who's being affected the most? Well, that is the poorest part of the population. The richest, they all handle it, no worry. But the poorest won't. So actually making that transformation is not only going green, but it's also really good for the general welfare of the population.
Other thoughts on equity and how you think about this challenge?
Well, I think building on that point, I mean, certainly in London, I suspect this is generally true. People on the lowest incomes tend to suffer the worst consequences of the current arrangements, right? They breathe the worst air, their children are most likely to be killed by speeding traffic, they have the greatest constraints in terms of affordable trips, say, to work. They often live a long way from where they work because of housing costs. So it seems to me that any set of policies that addresses the transportation problems, there's a point that Salita made several times yesterday, will align with those objectives as well. So if you provide better public transport, if you ensure that your fares are affordable, if you make your streets safer to walk and cycle on, if you improve the quality of local services so that people can get stuff nearby rather than having to travel long distances, that in general has got to be good for people on low incomes. So it seems to me that these are generally win-win outcomes. The environmental, health, social equity benefits are generally aligned. There are some hard cases. One of the questions around congestion charging, is that inequitable? As it happened, very, very few low-income employees would have been driving into central London. That was overwhelmingly done by much richer people. So in that case, there wasn't really a significant equity implication. But you do have to watch for those hard cases. But in general, it seems to me these things are very helpfully aligned.
When you see the map of the air pollution, for example, in Paris, you see that the people who are living near the highways and also the ring road around Paris, who are not rich people, are suffering from that. So the action against air pollution is also it's a question of public health, but it's also a question of social equity.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we're almost at the end of the panel here, and I wanted to give each of you about 30 seconds to kind of give us your pitch. The work we've been doing with the Southern California Association of Governments, we're talking about something called a GO zone. And that would be a real mobility innovation zone where we could stack up multiple transportation choices and policies and strategies to see if we could really move the needle on traffic, on carbon pollution, on behavior, on mode shift, and really try to do something meaningful and significant. So I wanted to ask you just if there's one thing that you would encourage Los Angeles leaders to consider putting into effect, whether it's a pilot or a program, an infrastructure investment, to be included in that GO zone concept. What do you want to give the audience here to sort of take away as your one recommendation? We'll go down the line.
Well, basically, I'll say, also continuing on the thing about decarbonization, I'll say there isn't one thing. I mean, just get started. You'll never regret it, because the changes you'll see by having that green transformation of cities is something that I think you'll never regret. And be it one thing or the other that leads to decarbonization and a better city, well, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and then that's cool. I mean, why wait a decade to define what is the right thing to do? No, just get started. Let's go.
You don't have said it, so I will say that. I will say bikes, bikes, bikes.
I usually say it, so yeah.
It's good for your health, it's good for your budget, it's good for the economy, and it's good for the planet.
Yep.
I would only say that one of the least expensive infrastructure components you can pay for is paint. Where do you paint the lines? So, you know, you don't have to throw down new asphalt. You can just scrape up the lines that are there, and that's your blank slate. How much space do you dedicate for each idea?
Great.
So I'm going to cheat and have two. Absolutely cycling. There was a great statistic I think Gabe Klein quoted today, which is that 50% of the trips in Los Angeles are less than 5 miles in length. That's like a 25-minute, not very fast bicycle ride. So in terms of potential to swap trips out of short car journeys into cycling, I think there's huge potential there, as long as the conditions are okay. And I also think there's huge potential in the city's bus network. If you look at the map of the bus network, it pretty much goes everywhere. So you have the kind of backbone of a mass transit system. The question is, how do you make it seem a sensible choice for a much broader group of travellers? And that was the first thing that Ken Livingston did alongside congestion charging, was hugely improve the quality and reliability of the bus service. And we've seen a massive growth in bus travel since 2001.
There you have it. Well, thank you all. Please join me in thanking our expert panel.
Great.
All right.
Thank you. Great.